The monitor flickered into life, projecting Adam Schiff's own visage back at him, capturing a moment from 2017, where he looked 8 years younger with darker hair and eyes burning with the hubristic certainty of a man convinced of his own invulnerability. He was positioned opposite Chuck Todd on an MSNBC broadcast, leaning aggressively into the microphone as his voice permeated the Senate hearing room with absolute crystalline definition. "Actually, no, Chuck. I can definitively state that the case extends far beyond mere speculation, and while I am restricted from sharing specifics, there is undeniably more than just circumstantial evidence available now." The footage abruptly transitioned to a different network, CNN, in December 2017. Yet the face remained unchanged, while the rhetoric intensified. The Russians extended an offer of assistance. The campaign eagerly accepted that assistance, and subsequently, both the Russians and the campaign attempted to obscure that assistance, which constitutes, in my view, the precise definition of collusion. The scene shifted to ABC in October 2017, where he told George Stephanopoulos that a substantial portion of that has been corroborated, referring specifically to the Steele dossier, a collection of scandalous allegations that Special Counsel Durham would eventually debunk as fabricated gossip originating from a Russian émigré who admitted to the FBI that his assertions were merely hearsay and bar talk. Schiff was explicitly informing the American public that these fabrications had been verified. The video cut again to MSNBC and Rachel Maddow in November 2017, where he proclaimed, "We are approaching a strictly prosecutable case," before jumping to CNN in 2019 to declare, "The evidence is arguably in plain sight." Finally, a clip from ABC in 2020 played where he asserted, "We now possess ample evidence," before the screen faded to black, leaving the hearing room in the Hart Senate office building in a heavy, suffocating silence. Every senator seated on the Intelligence Committee remained frozen in place, while the press gallery, which had been vibrating with noise since the session convened, fell completely still. Somewhere in the rear of the room, a solitary camera shutter snapped once before ceasing, drawing attention to Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, who was seated at the witness table wearing a severe dark navy suit. Her posture was rigid and military straight, reflecting the bearing of a woman who had dedicated 2 decades to uniform service, endured 3 deployments to active combat zones, and spent sufficient time in hearing rooms to understand that silence, when weaponized correctly, resonates louder than any verbal accusation. She allowed the quiet to linger for 3 entire seconds to maximize the tension before she finally began to speak. "Now, Senator, permit me to read into the record exactly what the witnesses who testified before your committee stated while under oath." She opened a simple manila folder rather than a thick binder, emphasizing that the truth was significantly more concise than the intricate web of lies. She quoted former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, reading, "I never encountered any direct empirical evidence indicating that the Trump campaign or any associate within it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians to interfere with the election." Turning the page, she cited former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, who, when asked if she possessed evidence of collusion, simply answered, "No." On another page, she referenced former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, who was asked the identical question and provided the identical answer, "No." She closed the folder firmly and said, "Senator Schiff, you were physically present in the room when these witnesses provided this testimony. You possessed their transcripts. You unilaterally classified them. You suppressed them for over a year. And you only released them when the White House threatened to disclose them first." Then, fully aware of what these witnesses had stated under oath, you appeared on television hundreds of times and communicated the exact opposite narrative to the American people. She locked eyes with him, and continued, "You did not merely misspeak, nor did you simply exaggerate. You lied deliberately and repeatedly for 7 years. Furthermore, you did this while maintaining a security clearance that granted you access to the most sensitive intelligence in this nation. Access you utilized not to enlighten the public, but to actively deceive them." Senator Adam Schiff sat 6 chairs to her left on the raised dais, his palms pressed flat against the mahogany desk, his face arranged in the disciplined mask of a man who has navigated politics for decades and understands that the lens captures every micro-expression. Behind that facade, however, something was fracturing. Not because the accusations were novel, he had heard variations of them for years, but because this time the charges were accompanied by his own voice, his own face, and his own words played back in undeniable sequence against the sworn testimony of his own witnesses. One might dismiss a verbal accusation or spin a newspaper headline, but it is impossible to unsay what has been recorded on camera. To fully comprehend how they arrived at this juncture, where the man who had spent 7 years serving as the avatar of the Russia investigation found himself watching his credibility disintegrate in real time, one must rewind 4 hours to the morning when Adam Schiff still operated under the belief that he was the prosecutor and Tulsi Gabbard was the defendant. He had arrived at the Russell Senate office building at 7:15 a.m., where his chief of staff, Patrick Boland, was already waiting with a briefing packet, 2 lattes, and a legal pad filled with talking points. "The declassification is the vulnerability," Boland had advised, noting, "She released the HPSCI report despite CIA objections, and former analysts are already on record expressing shock at the level of detail, while Warner has already labeled it reckless." "That is your primary line of attack," Schiff had said, nodding as he sat at his desk and unsealed the packet. Inside the folder were 3 distinct lines of questioning, each meticulously crafted to achieve the singular objective of framing Tulsi Gabbard as a political operative utilizing the intelligence apparatus to exact revenge on behalf of Donald Trump. The strategy had proven effective before, having worked against Devin Nunes when he released his memo in 2018 and against John Durham when his report was published in 2023. The playbook was elementary and battle-tested. Accuse the accuser of politicization. Invoke the sacred phrase sources and methods. Express grave concern regarding the degradation of intelligence partnerships. And allow the media to handle the heavy lifting. CNN would inevitably run the Gabbard endangers national security chyron. MSNBC would book 4 former intelligence officials to voice their alarm, and the New York Times editorial board would pen a piece about the erosion of institutional norms. By evening, the hearing would be memorialized, not for what Gabbard testified, but for what Schiff declared about her actions. "She is a former Democrat who defected for power," Schiff reasoned, adding, "The media already distrusts her, so this should be straightforward." His communications director, a young woman named Elena, looked up from her smartphone to interject. "Her approval among independents is actually higher than you might anticipate, sitting at 43% in the last Reuters poll, and the military background plays very well." Schiff dismissed this concern with a wave of his hand, insisting, "Military background is irrelevant in a hearing concerning intelligence declassification. She lacks the technical credentials, as she has never been an analyst, nor run an intelligence operation. She secured the job solely because she stood on a debate stage and endorsed Trump. And that is the story." He had spent the previous evening rehearsing his inquiries in his Senate office, adhering to the method he always employed before a high-profile hearing. His routine involved writing the question on a note card, practicing the delivery 3 times, and timing the dramatic pause perfectly. He understood precisely when to decelerate for emphasis, exactly when to shift his gaze from the witness to the camera, and exactly when to repeat a phrase to ensure it made the evening clip. He had rehearsed 5 specific questions, each one culminating in the same conclusion. Gabbard is a political operative rather than an intelligence professional. She is declassifying documents to aid Trump rather than to inform the public, and she acts as a weapon rather than a watchdog. The censure did not stick, Boland reminded him, adding, "It actually boosted your fundraising, just as Durham didn't stick, and Mueller didn't stick." She is going to raise the same talking points Republicans have been utilizing for years, and you will deflect them in the same manner you always do. Schiff smiled, knowing he had survived worse, including the Mueller investigation finding no conspiracy, the Durham report, and the censure resolution, which he had actually monetized by turning the rebuke into a badge of honor and proof that he was so effective against Trump that Republicans were forced to officially punish him. He had successfully transformed every attack into a weapon, every accusation into a fundraising email, and every setback into a narrative of political persecution. What Schiff did not realize, because he had spent so long being the singular entity controlling the narrative that he had forgotten others could control it too, was that Tulsi Gabbard had spent 3 weeks preparing for this hearing with the mindset of a combat medic preparing for a mass casualty event. She worked methodically and quietly, operating with the understanding that when the critical moment arrives, there is absolutely no time to improvise. 3 miles away in a secure conference room at ODNI headquarters in McLean, Virginia, Gabbard sat with her general counsel, Marcus Webb, and a small team of analysts who had spent the past month constructing what they darkly referred to as the Schiff file. The file was organized chronologically, beginning in January 2017 and concluding in July 2025, containing 3 categories of material that were devastating individually but catastrophic in combination. Category 1 consisted of every public statement Adam Schiff had made regarding Russia collusion on television, radio, or in print, totaling over 200 instances. The team had compiled them into a searchable database, complete with timestamps, networks, and exact quotes, and they had also edited a professional 12-minute compilation video showing Schiff making the exact same claims across dozens of appearances year after year. Phrases like more than circumstantial evidence, collusion is a fact, the evidence is in plain sight, and ample evidence were repeated with the same confident delivery and the same careful eye contact with the camera. Category 2 contained the sworn testimony of Obama administration officials before Schiff's own committee. Testimony that Schiff had kept classified until he was forced to release it. Clapper, Yates, Rice, Lynch, Comey, Power, and Rhodes, not a single one of them had confirmed the existence of evidence regarding collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Category 3 included the declassified documents from July 2025, the HPSCI report, the whistleblower account, and internal emails demonstrating how the intelligence assessment on Russian interference had been constructed, revised, and promoted despite internal dissent regarding its conclusions. He will attack the declassification, Webb predicted, citing sources and methods and CIA objections, as that is his comfort zone. Let him, Gabbard replied, because every time he speaks about the sanctity of classified information, I get the opportunity to ask him about reading the Steele dossier into the congressional record, a document funded by the Clinton campaign and sourced from a fired FBI informant that the FBI's own subsource admitted was based on rumor. He entered that material into the permanent record of the United States Congress as fact, she said as she closed the file. He believes this hearing is about me, about what I declassified, and about whether I am qualified," she continued. "He is going to spend his 5 minutes attempting to put me on trial, and every time he opens a door, I am going to walk through it using his own words." Webb nodded and asked, "What if he doesn't take the bait?" "He will," Gabbard asserted, "because he cannot help himself. He has spent 8 years being the smartest person in every room, the person nobody challenges, and the media's favorite prosecutor. He has never been in a hearing where the witness fights back, and he has certainly never been in a hearing where the witness possesses his transcripts." She paused to pick up a printout. A screenshot of Schiff on CNN from February 2018 captioned, "Schiff, evidence of collusion is clear," and asked, "You know what is remarkable about this?" He did not even need to be careful. He could say anything at all, and nobody in the media would push back. Not Chuck Todd, not Rachel Maddow, and not Anderson Cooper. He possessed the magic shield of being the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, claiming access to classified information others did not have, demanding they trust him. And for years, they did. The only person who ever pushed back on a major network was Morgan Ortagus on The View in 2021, and she was a guest host, not even a regular. She asked him point-blank about the Steele dossier, and he dismissed her premise as a smokescreen, which shows how insulated he has been. One adversarial question in 7 years is nothing, and we are going to give him a lot more than one, she said as Webb looked at the flash drive containing the compilation video and asked, "Are we sure about playing this in the hearing, as it is unprecedented?" "So was reading fabricated intelligence into the congressional record," Gabbard countered, "and so was inventing presidential quotes and calling it parody, and so was lying about talking to a whistleblower. He set the precedent for the unprecedented, so I am merely following his lead, except he has never been in a hearing with someone who used to sit on his side of the aisle and knows exactly how the machine works." The hearing commenced promptly at 10 a.m., with the room at capacity 30 minutes prior to the gavel, and Schiff arrived through the main entrance, pausing briefly for the camera cluster in the hallway. "Today, we hold the intelligence community accountable for politically motivated declassifications that endanger American sources and methods," he told a reporter from CNN. He wore a charcoal suit and a blue tie, his standard hearing attire chosen because it reads well on camera and projects the sober authority of a man who takes classified information seriously. The irony of that particular projection would become apparent within the hour, as Gabbard entered through a side door with no entourage and no dramatic statement to the press. Just a woman with a folder and a flash drive walking to the witness table. She wore a dark navy suit with no jewelry and no accessories, a deliberate aesthetic choice meant to evoke a military briefer rather than a politician. She adjusted her microphone, poured a glass of water, and waited, not looking at Schiff, because she did not need to. She knew exactly where he was sitting and exactly what he was planning to say. She had read every hearing transcript he had ever participated in, learning his rhythms and his tells, such as the way he builds to a dramatic question and then pauses for the camera, or the way he restates a premise 3 times, because he knows the third repetition is the one that gets clipped. She had studied him the way a combat medic studies an anatomy chart, not to heal, but to know exactly where to apply pressure. Chairwoman Susan Collins brought the room to order and read the opening statement. "The Select Committee on Intelligence will come to order. Today we will hear testimony from Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard regarding recent declassifications of intelligence community documents related to the 2016 election and the origins of the Russia investigation." The first hour remained strictly procedural, with Republican senators asking about the declassification process, the whistleblower protections Gabbard had implemented, and the progress of the declassification and intelligence group she had established at ODNI. Gabbard answered in the clipped, precise language of an intelligence briefer, offering facts, dates, and numbers with absolutely no editorializing. Democratic senators followed a coordinated line of attack, with Senator Warner of Virginia asking about CIA objections to the declassification and Senator Heinrich of New Mexico raising concerns about foreign partner relationships. Senator King of Maine asked whether the documents had been reviewed by all 17 intelligence agencies before release, and Gabbard answered each question directly, acknowledging the concerns while noting that the president possessed constitutional declassification authority. Then, it was Schiff's turn, and he adjusted his microphone, straightened his notes, and looked down at the witness table, the way he had looked at hundreds of witnesses before, resembling a prosecutor looking at a defendant who does not yet know the trap has been set. "Director Gabbard," he began, "in July you declassified a House Intelligence Committee staff report from 2020 that had been kept classified by both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. You did so over the objections of CIA officials who warned, and I am quoting from NBC News, that the level of detail exposed could alert Moscow to how intelligence was collected and potentially endanger sources." Former CIA analyst Michael Van Landingham said he was shocked at what was revealed. So my question is simple. Did you prioritize political impact over the safety of intelligence sources? Gabbard leaned toward her microphone and replied, "Senator, thank you for the question. The decision to declassify was made in coordination with the President, who has constitutional authority over classification. I take the protection of sources and methods extremely seriously, as someone who served in a combat zone in Iraq, in Kuwait, and on the Horn of Africa, where my life depended on the quality and security of intelligence. I understand the stakes in a way that goes beyond the theoretical." "With respect, Director, you didn't answer my question," Schiff interrupted. "I am getting there, Senator," she said, "for I wanted to establish my perspective on classified information because you have raised the subject of its sanctity, and I would like to address that directly." She opened her folder and stated, "On March 20th, 2017, you sat in this building, not this room, but the House equivalent, and during an Intelligence Committee hearing, you read allegations from the Steele dossier into the congressional record." The Steele dossier was a collection of opposition research funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign through the law firm Perkins Coie and the research firm Fusion GPS. Its primary source, Igor Danchenko, was later charged by Special Counsel Durham with making false statements to the FBI, and Danchenko himself told the FBI in January 2017, 2 months before your hearing, that his information was, and I quote, "hearsay and just talk." She looked up and continued, "The FBI had already discredited the dossier's key claims and fired Christopher Steele as an informant by the time you read it into the congressional record, and Inspector General Horowitz later found 17 significant errors and omissions in the FISA applications that relied on it. And yet you presented those allegations, unverified, debunked, and sourced from Kremlin-linked gossip as fact on the floor of Congress in the permanent record. So when you ask me about the sanctity of classified information, Senator, I take the question seriously, but I would respectfully note that the person asking it is the same person who entered fabricated intelligence into the congressional record and defended it on 200 television appearances. The hearing room shifted, not dramatically like a courtroom scene in a movie, but there was a perceptible change in the quality of attention, the way people stop looking at their phones and start looking at the people in front of them. Schiff's jaw tightened, for he had expected the Steele dossier to come up and had an answer prepared, one he had used before on The View, and on CNN in dozens of interviews. He couldn't have known people were lying to steal, was the defense, and the dossier needed to be investigated, so he was doing his job. Director Gabbard, he said, the Steele dossier was a matter of legitimate concern that warranted investigation, and I stand by the committee's decision to examine its allegations. Senator, I am not asking about the committee's decision. I am asking about yours, she countered. I am asking about your personal decision to read unverified claims into the permanent record. Your personal decision to go on television afterward and tell Chuck Todd you had seen more than circumstantial evidence of collusion. Your personal decision to tell CNN that collusion was a fact. And your personal decision to tell Rachel Maddow you were very close to a prosecutable case. She paused and said, I would like to tell you what the witnesses who testified to your own committee said under oath in closed session testimony you classified and kept secret until 2020. Former DNI James Clapper. I never saw any direct empirical evidence that the Trump campaign or someone in it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians. Former Deputy AG Sally Yates asked if she had seen evidence of collusion. No. Former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. No. Former Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Former UN Ambassador Samantha Power. And former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. None of them, not one, confirmed the existence of evidence that you claimed to have on television. You had their transcripts, Senator. You sat in the room when they said this, and then you went on camera and told the American people the opposite. She let the fact sit in the air like smoke before adding, and I can speak to this from a particular vantage point, Senator, because when you were making those claims, I was a member of the Democratic Party. I was serving in the House of Representatives. I was watching you do it. And what I saw, a colleague using classified access to deceive the public for political advantage, is one of the reasons I left the party. This was the moment Schiff hadn't prepared for, not the accusations themselves, which he had heard before, but the source. Gabbard wasn't a Republican operative or a Fox News commentator. She was a former Democrat, a former colleague, and a combat veteran who had served in Baghdad while he was building his television career. The partisan attack defense, which had shielded him for years, collapsed the moment she said the words, "When you were making those claims, I was a member of the Democratic Party." Schiff regrouped, relying on his experience as a former prosecutor to absorb a blow and redirect, leaning into his microphone to speak with the controlled intensity of a man who has been doing this for a very long time. Director Gabbard, I appreciate the theatrical presentation, but let's be clear about what is happening here. You left the Democratic Party, you campaigned for Donald Trump, he rewarded you with this position, and now you are using the intelligence apparatus, the same apparatus you accuse me of politicizing, to conduct a political prosecution of a sitting United States senator. This isn't oversight. This is retribution. Gabbard nodded slowly and said, Senator, you are right that I left the Democratic Party. But let me tell you why. Her voice shifted, becoming not louder but deeper. The voice of someone accessing something real. In 2004, I was a state representative in Hawaii, 23 years old, and I had just been re-elected when my unit, the 29th Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the Hawaii Army National Guard, was called up for deployment to Iraq. I wasn't on the mandatory roster, and my commander told me I could stay home, keep my seat, and keep my career, but I volunteered instead. I became the first sitting state official in American history to voluntarily leave public office to serve in a war zone, where I served in a medical unit at Logistical Support Area Anaconda in Baghdad, treating wounded soldiers and reading casualty lists every morning looking for names I recognized. The sign at the entrance to our base said, "Is today the day?" And that was our greeting every day for 12 months. When I came home, I served in Congress as a Democrat for 8 years. I ran for president as a Democrat, and I served on the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. What I saw, Senator, from the inside was a party that would say anything, use any institution, and weaponize any piece of intelligence to maintain power. The Russia collusion narrative wasn't intelligence analysis, it was a political operation, and you were its chief architect. So no, Senator, I didn't leave because Trump recruited me. I left because of what I saw people like you doing with classified information, watching you go on television and claim you had evidence that didn't exist while the actual evidence, the testimony of your own witnesses, sat in a classified vault that you refused to open. I served in Baghdad while you served on CNN, and I take the integrity of intelligence more seriously than you ever have. The room was quiet, and Schiff's communications team, watching from a staff office on the 3rd floor, exchanged a look that political operatives exchange when they realize the playbook isn't working. Elena texted Boland, "He needs to pivot now." But Schiff didn't pivot. Schiff did what Schiff always does when a line of attack isn't working. He escalated. It was the instinct that had made him famous, and the instinct that would now unmake him. Director Gabbard, since you have raised the subject of credibility, let me remind you, but Gabbard interrupted. Senator, since you have raised it, let me add to the record. She didn't wait for permission, and the cadence of the exchange had shifted so that she was no longer answering questions but conducting a deposition. September 26, 2019. You chaired a hearing on the Ukraine whistleblower complaint, and in your opening statement, broadcast live to millions of Americans, you read what you presented as the President's words to President Zelensky. You said, and I quote, "I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent. Understand, lots of it, on this and on that. And I'm going to say this only 7 times, so you better listen good." The president never said those words, not in the transcript, not in any version of the call, and not in any witness account. You fabricated them. When Representative Mike Turner confronted you, you said your reading was meant to be at least part in parody. Parody, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, the person entrusted with oversight of the most sensitive intelligence operations in the United States, fabricated presidential quotes during an impeachment hearing that was broadcast to the entire nation, and he called it parody. She turned a page and continued. 8 days before that hearing, on September 17, 2019, you appeared on MSNBC, where a reporter asked you directly whether you or your committee had communicated with the whistleblower. You said, and I quote, "We have not spoken directly with the whistleblower. We would like to." PolitiFact rated that statement false. Your committee staff had in fact communicated with the whistleblower before the complaint was filed. The whistleblower had approached your aide, and your aide had briefed you on the outlines of the complaint. You knew, and you said the opposite on national television. And then, when the coordination between your staff and the whistleblower was publicly revealed, you reversed course. You had been demanding that the whistleblower testify publicly, but once the coordination was exposed, you blocked the testimony, proving you wanted transparency only until transparency would expose you. Schiff opened his mouth and closed it, looking to Chairwoman Collins, hoping she might intervene on time. But his 5 minutes weren't up, and he still had time, though the problem was that he had nothing to fill it with. Every prepared response, "I stand by the committee's work. This is a partisan distraction. The evidence speaks for itself," sounded hollow against the specific, dated, documented record that Gabbard was reading into this hearing the way he had once read the Steele dossier into his. Gabbard continued, "And since we are discussing patterns of credibility, Senator, I will note one more item for the record. In May 2025, The director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency submitted a criminal referral to the Department of Justice alleging that you falsified bank documents and property records on 5 Fannie Mae loans between 2003 and 2019. The allegation is that you claimed your Maryland home as your primary residence on mortgage applications while simultaneously claiming your California condominium as your primary residence for a homeowner's tax exemption, both at once for 16 years. Fannie Mae's Financial Crimes Unit concluded you engaged in what they called a sustained pattern of possible occupancy misrepresentation, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland has reportedly opened an investigation. I don't know if you are guilty, Senator, as that is for the Justice Department to determine, but I find it relevant to this hearing that a man who spent 7 years accusing a president of being compromised by a foreign power based on evidence that his own witnesses said didn't exist is now accused with documentary evidence of lying to banks to get better mortgage rates. Schiff's face had gone through several phases during the exchange: controlled composure, studied indifference, a flash of anger when the mortgage referral came up, and now something else. It looked to the trained eye of the C-SPAN cameras like the particular stillness of a man who realizes he is watching his own narrative collapse and has no way to stop it. "This is exactly what the Trump administration wants," he said, though his voice had lost its prosecutorial edge and was replaced by something tighter and more defensive. "Using the intelligence apparatus to persecute political opponents is authoritarianism," he stated. Senator Gabbard said, "I would like to play something for the committee, if the chairwoman permits," and Collins nodded. Gabbard's aide pressed a button. The screens on either side of the hearing room lit up, and now we were back where we started. The compilation. Schiff's own face, his own voice, clip after clip after clip. More than circumstantial evidence. Collusion is a fact. The evidence is in plain sight. Ample evidence. Very close to a prosecutable case. Corroborated. Year after year, network after network, the same claims, the same confidence, and the same careful eye contact with the camera that had made him one of the most recognizable Democrats in America played out before the room. Then the audio shifted to the flat, formal cadence of sworn testimony. Clappers saying, "I never saw any direct empirical evidence." Yates saying no, and Rice saying no. The screen went dark, and Gabbard spoke into the silence. "Senator Schiff has spent the last 7 years telling the American people that he had evidence of a conspiracy between a president and a foreign power. He didn't. He told them the Steele dossier had been corroborated. It hadn't. He fabricated presidential quotes in an impeachment hearing and called it parody. He lied about communicating with a whistleblower and then blocked that whistleblower from testifying when the lie was exposed. He read unverified gossip funded by a political campaign into the congressional record as fact. He kept witness transcripts classified for over a year because they contradicted his public claims and only released them when forced. He was censured by the House of Representatives on June 21, 2023, by a vote of 213 to 209, and he had to stand in the well of the House while the resolution was read aloud, a resolution stating that he abused this trust by alleging he had evidence of collusion that never existed, and he is now under federal investigation for mortgage fraud. "I served in Iraq, and I know what real threats to this country look like. Mortars, IEDs, casualty lists, the sign that said, 'Is today the day?' I can tell you that the greatest threat to American democracy is not a foreign adversary. It is an elected official who uses the most sensitive information in this country to deceive the people who trusted him with it." The documents I've declassified tell the truth, Senator, and Schiff has spent 7 years trying to prevent the American people from seeing that truth. But today they saw it. She closed her folder, and Chairwoman Collins waited 2 seconds before stating, "The Senator's time has expired. Director Gabbard, thank you for your testimony." "Madam Chairwoman, I categorically reject," Schiff began, but Collins repeated, "The Senator's time has expired. The committee will stand in recess for 15 minutes. Schiff sat in his chair as the gavel fell. Senators stood and began filing out. Staff moved through the aisles, and the press gallery erupted into the controlled chaos of reporters filing urgent dispatches on phones and laptops. Schiff did not stand. He sat perfectly still, looking at the blank screen where his own face had been playing moments ago. His chief of staff approached from behind, leaned down, and whispered something, but Schiff shook his head. "Not yet," he murmured, thinking about the compilation, not about its content, which he had heard before, but about its form. The side-by-side, his own face, and his own voice, unedited and unmanipulated, playing next to the sworn testimony of people he had supervised. There was no way to call it doctored, no way to call it taken out of context, and no way to call it Russian disinformation or a Republican hit job. It was his words on camera on networks he chose in interviews he requested, said with the confidence of a man who believed nobody would ever compile them and hold them up against the actual record. He thought about the Steele dossier he had read into the congressional record on March 20th, 2017, remembering the moment and remembering believing it, or telling himself he believed it, or telling himself it was worth reading because it might be true. The distinction between those three things had blurred years ago, and he had never been forced to examine which one was real because nobody had ever made him answer for it under these conditions. He was not in a cable news interview where he controlled the conversation, not in a friendly congressional hearing where the chairman was an ally, but in a room where a combat veteran with declassified documents and a flash drive full of his own television appearances was reading his record back to him like a court reporter reading a transcript. Boland appeared again, urging, "We need to get to the press room. The longer we wait, the worse it looks." So Schiff said, "Give me a minute," sat for another 30 seconds, then stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the hallway. For 6 minutes, no Democrat on the committee posted anything on any social media platform. In the Senate, where political communication is measured in seconds, 6 minutes of silence is a geological age. The clips went viral within the hour, but not the individual quotes, as those had been circulated before. What went viral was the compilation, the side-by-side. Schiff's own voice making claims on the left half of the screen, with his own witnesses denying those claims under oath on the right half, was simple, devastating, and required no commentary because the contrast did the work. The first version to break was a 38-second cut of Schiff saying, "More than circumstantial evidence," followed immediately by Clapper saying, "No direct empirical evidence," which hit 20 million views by dinner time and 53 million by the next morning. The second clip that traveled was the Baghdad versus CNN exchange, with Gabbard's voice measured and flat saying, "I served in Baghdad while you served on CNN, and I take the integrity of intelligence more seriously than you ever have." Someone synced it to a slow-motion video of Schiff's face as she said it, highlighting the expression, or rather, the careful absence of expression, the controlled blankness of a man who has just been hit in a place he didn't know was exposed, which instantly became a meme. The third was the parody takedown, featuring Gabbard reading Schiff's fabricated Trump-Zelensky quotes back to him, followed by the single word parody, over which someone overlaid a dictionary definition of parody with a question mark. It was shared 4 million times in 24 hours. Schiff held a press conference 90 minutes after the hearing recessed, standing in the Russell Building hallway with his communications director and two sympathetic senators to deliver the statement his team had prepared during the recess. "What you saw today," he said, "was the latest example of the Trump administration using the intelligence community as a weapon against its political opponents." Director Gabbard's performance was not oversight. It was political theater designed to distract from this administration's systematic dismantling of the institutions that protect our democracy. The words were right. The framing was right. And the delivery was polished. But the problem was structural. Gabbard hadn't mentioned Trump once during the exchange, hadn't mentioned the Republican Party, and hadn't mentioned any political agenda. She had read Schiff's own words back to him and compared them to the sworn testimony of his own witnesses. So while you can call that political theater, you cannot call it partisan when the evidence comes from the subject's own mouth. Progressive media tried the familiar pattern. With MSNBC running the chyron, Gabbard turns hearing into political spectacle, and the Huffington Post running, former Democrat uses DNI position to attack Schiff. But the compilation video made the coverage irrelevant. 53 million people had watched Schiff say more than circumstantial evidence, and then watched Clapper say no direct empirical evidence. And the spin couldn't survive the side-by-side. The most unexpected reaction came not from Republicans or Democrats, but from former Democrats. People who had left the party over the past 4 years and seen in Gabbard a reflection of their own journey. A retired Army sergeant in Ohio posted a video that got 11 million views saying, "I left the Democratic Party in 2022 because of exactly what Gabbard described. They weaponized everything, intelligence, the DOJ, the media, and Schiff was the face of it. I watched him say he had evidence for 3 years, he didn't, and I feel like an idiot for believing him." A veteran journalist writing anonymously for a media criticism newsletter published a piece that ricocheted through newsrooms. "I spent 3 years repeating Adam Schiff's claims about collusion evidence on air. He was my most frequent source, articulate, authoritative, and absolutely certain. And he was lying. I knew the intelligence community wasn't confirming his claims, but I ran them anyway because he had clearance and credibility. He used us, we let him, and that's on both of us." A former Democratic state senator from Michigan, who had left the party in 2023, posted a thread that was shared 250,000 times. "I canvassed for Democrats using the Russia collusion story. I told voters their democracy was under attack by a foreign power because I believed Adam Schiff. Today, I watched him sit in silence while his own words were played back to him, and I feel betrayed, not by Republicans, but by the man I trusted to tell me the truth." A Gold Star mother from Virginia called into a radio show and said something that was shorter and more devastating than anything said in the hearing room. "My son died in Afghanistan. Adam Schiff voted for the war and said he had intelligence. Then he spent 7 years saying he had intelligence about Russia. Was that a lie too? And how many things did he say he had intelligence about that turned out to be nothing?" The question hung in the air, not because it had an answer, but because it revealed the nature of the wound. Schiff's credibility hadn't been damaged on a single issue. It had been damaged as a category. If a man will lie about having evidence of the most serious conspiracy in modern American history, and if he will maintain that lie for 7 years on hundreds of television appearances while knowing his own witnesses contradicted him, then what can you believe him about? What can you trust? And where does the lying stop? In California, the reaction was complicated. Schiff had won his Senate seat in 2024 with a comfortable margin, and his approval rating was steady. But internal polls taken in the 2 weeks after the hearing showed a 7-point drop. This wasn't because Californians suddenly supported Trump. but because the compilation video forced a simple question that no amount of spin could answer. If he lied about this, what else did he lie about? The mortgage fraud investigation continued quietly, and while the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland had not yet announced any charging decisions, the shadow of a federal investigation hung over every public appearance Schiff made. The irony was lost on no one. The man who had spent 7 years accusing a president of financial crimes was now himself the subject of a federal financial investigation. The man who had demanded transparency was now invoking the presumption of innocence, and the man who had read unverified documents into the congressional record was now asking the public to wait for all the facts before reaching conclusions. The deeper damage wasn't in any single clip or headline, it was in the pattern that Gabbard had illuminated, a pattern so consistent, so documented, and so visible in his own words on his own television appearances that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Claim to have evidence that doesn't exist, read fabricated documents into the congressional record, fabricate presidential quotes, and call it parody. Lie about contact with a whistleblower and then block the whistleblower's testimony when the lie is exposed. Keep witness transcripts classified when they contradict your public claims. Claim 2 primary residences simultaneously for 16 years to save money on mortgages, and through it all maintain the posture of a man defending democracy from its enemies while systematically deceiving the people democracy is supposed to serve. Gabbard didn't call him a traitor, she didn't call him a criminal, and she didn't call him a Russian asset, which would have been the kind of irony he deserved, but she was too disciplined to deliver. She called him something more precise, something that would be harder to shake, and something that would attach to his name in the way that epithets attach to political figures when the public finally sees the gap between the performance and the record. She called him an architect of lies. Gabbard returned to ODNI headquarters after the hearing, did not hold a press conference, did not post on social media, and simply went back to work reviewing intelligence assessments and preparing foreign threat briefings, the kind of work that doesn't trend on Twitter because it is classified. When Webb asked her how she thought it went, she said, "I answered his questions, I showed his record, and that's what oversight is supposed to look like." "That's not what his hearings usually looked like," Webb said. And Gabbard agreed, "No, because in his hearings, the witnesses were afraid of the camera, they were afraid of the clip, and they were afraid of being called a Trump loyalist on the evening news." They forgot that a hearing room is a fact-finding venue, not a television studio. And in a fact-finding venue, the person with the better facts wins, not the person with the better camera angle. When a reporter asked her for comment the next day, she said only, "The documents speak for themselves, and so do Senator Schiff's own words." An architect builds structures that are designed to look solid, to look permanent, and to look real. And for 7 years, Schiff's structures had looked real. The collusion narrative, the dossier, the parody, and the whistleblower coordination. Each one was a carefully constructed edifice that served its purpose for a time, and then, when examined closely, turned out to be built on nothing. Gabbard didn't demolish those structures with accusations, she demolished them with the architect's own blueprints, his own words, his own TV appearances, and his own classified transcripts. She held up the plans and showed the public that the foundations were empty. So he walked into the hearing room as the questioner and walked out as the subject, not because Gabbard attacked him, but because she turned on the television and he attacked himself. In the weeks that followed, Schiff did what he had always done. He gave interviews, he raised money, and he posted on social media about threats to democracy and the importance of standing firm against authoritarianism. The machine still worked, the donors still donated, and the base still rallied. But something had shifted. a change that doesn't show up in polls or fundraising numbers, but in something harder to measure. It was the pause, the moment of hesitation when a reporter considers quoting Schiff as a source and remembers the compilation video, the moment when a colleague considers co-signing a letter and remembers the Clapper transcript, or the moment when a voter hears him say, "I have evidence," and thinks, "You said that before." Trust, once broken by your own recorded voice, doesn't come back. Not because people are unforgiving, but because the human mind cannot unwatch what it has watched. 53 million people had watched Adam Schiff contradict himself clip by clip, year by year, in his own words on his own chosen stages with his own confident delivery. The architect had built his most impressive structure, and then, in a hearing room in the Hart Building, a combat veteran from Hawaii showed the American people that the building had no foundation. She didn't demolish it, she just turned on the lights. And the building, which had looked so solid in the dark, so imposing, so permanent, and so real, turned out to be hollow. It was a facade built from television appearances, classified access, and the particular authority that comes from saying, "I've seen the intelligence," to a country that had no way to check, but now they could check. The transcripts were public. The compilation was everywhere. The documents were declassified. And a combat veteran who had served in Baghdad, Kuwait, and the Horn of Africa had done the simplest and most devastating thing a person can do to an architect of lies. She showed the blueprints, and the American people, 53 million of them and counting, looked at the blueprints and looked at the building, and saw that there was nothing inside, for there never had been.